Okay, so hey guys, it's Rogue Magician here, and we're back at it again with another deck profile. Surprisingly enough, today's video isn't going to be an update on Dogmatica, but actually a new deck entirely. As you likely already saw from the title, the deck that I'm playing currently is Generaider Runick. So a couple of things on why I'm playing this specific deck. The first thing is that I usually have two decks each format that I play. Like my main deck is obviously either going to be Spellbook or Dogmatica, but once I get tired of playing that deck week after week, I'll break it up a bit and, play some weird runic variant. Case in point, Generaider Runick. But yeah, I've been exploring runic variants since, before they were released, so I'm always looking for new ways of playing the deck. And one of those decks that I've tested a long time ago was actually Generaider Runick. So, the initial reasons why I decided to combine those two decks together back then was from the fact that both of the archetypes are actually a part of the same lore. I can go more in depth with it, but this isn't like a lore video. But it's pretty apparent once you get into the artworks for both engines. So for instance, I probably had this in the thumbnail, but this guy here, he's actually the guy in Runick Allure, which is this card here. And in addition to that, you can also see the depiction of Har, which is one of the generator bosses in Runick Fountain. And you can kind of see the similarities here as well. So that is pretty much the case for all of the Runick and Generator monsters. Like there's going to be some crossover between both archetypes if you look hard enough. And if you're curious, I'll just put a link to the wiki page for it if you're interested. So before getting into the main deck, I just wanted to say a couple things on the deck overall. So you're playing 40 cards, which is nice. Additionally, you want to go first with this deck, but it functions just fine going second as well. Just as long as you're able to resolve Boss Stage, then you're pretty much set. And lastly, like at the end of the day, this is a generator deck. The Runick engine is simply used in this deck for extension and for additional disruptions. So just keep that in mind when going through the card by card, because you may be confused as to why I'm running some cards and not others. So first off, I will start out with the Runick engine because it just makes sense to start out with this first. And the cards that you're running are 3 Runick tips, and you're also just running 1 copy of the more powerful spells in the engine. So you're running 1 Slumber, 1 Freezing Curses, 1 Destruction, and 1 Flashing Fire. And in addition to that, you're also running 1 Golden Droplets, which is pretty unconventional, but I'll explain this in a bit. But before that, I'll just kind of talk about the ratios. So you're only running 8 Runick spells. That may seem unorthodox, which it is, but you just need to know like what the function of Runick is in this deck. The main function is simply just to have a consistent way of getting into Sleipnir. And if you're going to be running 8 spells that does the exact same thing, then it's very likely that you're going to have at least 1 Runick spell in your initial mulligan. So there's a bunch of calculators online in order to like try to calculate the probability of you drawing cards. So if you're running 8 of them, it's more than 50% that you're going to have at least 1 of them. So 1 Runick spell and either Monstrosity or Vala is typically full combo. But I'll get into that later on in the deck profile. But yeah, that's kind of the main utility of this engine, is just to get out Sleipnir, which is a level 9, which helps with the level 9 toolbox of the deck. The other supplemental effects of these cards are simply like secondary. They're just like the cherry on top. So yeah, just going over those individually now. Tip, obviously searches out any of these other Runick spells, and it just gives you knowledge of what your opponent's playing, because they banish the top card from their deck face up. So you can kind of like gauge on which specific exceeds that you want to go into depending on what your opponent's playing, just from that type of knowledge that you're getting from the banishing. These, obviously do things individually on their own, so you're running 1 copy of each. But Golden Droplets is particularly interesting in this deck because most of the generator cards have detrimental effects for your opponent when they draw a card. So for like the field spell, if they draw a card, you can just special summon a generator monster and then fill your board up with a bunch of tokens. And if you have Har, Generator Boss Storms out on the board, if your opponent draws, you can force them to send a monster from their field or from their hand to the graveyard. So this card just kind of forces those interactions in this particular deck. So that's why I decided just to run 1 copy of it. So for the generator engine, you are running 3 copies of Generaider Boss Stage, and you're also running 1 terraforming. So before I get into this card, I'll just kind of address like the elephant in the room. So you're not running Runick Fountain in this build. That's intentional because for the Runick cards, you're only running 8 of them, and it doesn't justify running a recursive spell like that. If you're running that little Runick spells in a deck, doesn't make much sense. In addition to that, like with the Runick cards and Fountain, it just has like inherent conflicts with other cards that you're running in a deck like Prosperity. So I decided not to run the Fountain and just focus on the more powerful field spell, at least in this context, which was Boss Stage. Because Boss Stage is your main win condition. So yeah, you max it out at 3 and also play the terraforming just to increase the chances of actually, getting into it. Because certain games you can just like pit a Boss Stage and pass and you're pretty much set for the turn. Moving on to the monsters, you're running 3 copies of Lopter, the shadow of the Generaider bosses. So he has a quick effect, tribute, where you can tribute any Generaider card that you control or any monster in order to special summon a Generaider from the deck. So he has a similar effect to Pankratops or Incredible Ecclesia, where he can actually target himself to special summon from the deck. So it's just very hard to interrupt that effect unless your opponent has something like Ash or Called by the Grave. And yeah, typically the card you're going to be summoning is usually Mardell, because she can search out the field spell. She's essentially just a Rhoda for the entire archetype. And he also has another effect where if you have this guy on board during your opponent's turn, he boosts up all your Generaider monsters by 1,000 attack and defense. So that also includes all the Generaider tokens. So this will be boosted up to 25/25 during your opponent's turn only. So the next card that you're running is 3 copies of Vala. So she's the newest card that was released for the Generaider archetype in Starbasome Access. She is really, really good. Actually critical in the deck, so you have to run 3 copies of her. And her use in the deck is mainly used as a combo starter and an extension. So if you're not familiar with the effect, she basically has her first effect that can be activated in the hand or in a graveyard. So it's actually pretty beneficial to actually put her in a graveyard once you go into a next seed to detach her. But her effect states that you can send a Generaider card that you have in your hand to the graveyard to special summon her, which is a good effect. And when you do special summon her, you can special summon another Generaider monster from your hand or graveyard. So technically, if you sent this to the graveyard in order to special summon her, you can just target the same card that you sent to the graveyard and then special summon it back. So it's just an instant level 9 exceeds right there. So moving on, you're running 2 copies of Har, Generaider Boss of Storms. So he's the main guy that you're going to be summoning off of the boss stage because he is an Omni Negate. His effect states that you can tribute 2 Generaider monsters or spellcasters in order to just negate any effect. But typically you're going to be using the Generaider tokens for that cost, because typically what you'll do is you summon him off a boss stage, and then since you summon during your opponent's turn, you fill up your entire board with a bunch of Generaider tokens. So you can just use these as the cost. And that's going to be the case for the other Generaider bosses that you're going to be running, which I'll get into after this one. But he also has another effect where if your opponent adds cards from their deck to their hand, you can force them to send a monster from their hand or field and send it to the graveyard. It's their choice what they want to do, but it's just a very easy way of getting rid of resources. And it goes in tandem with the effect of like running golden droplets, like forcing your opponent to draw in order to get these detrimental effects when they do. So yeah, in terms of ratios, I like running 2 because typically off a boss stage, you'll be summoning him in order to get the Omni Negate. And he's also 3000, so it's going to be very hard for your opponent to get over it, but usually they'll be able to, especially if you already used the Omni Negate already. But if your opponent didn't get rid of your boss stage, then during their next turn, you just summon another one. And usually from testing, I noticed that my opponent can't get over 2 of these. So I always just want, the insurance of having 2 in the deck, just so that I can ensure that I'll be able to close out games, because getting over 2 Hars is pretty hard. And in addition to that, if I do exhaust the resource of just special summoning it directly from the deck, I can just special summon Vala off of Boss Stage and then summon out the Har from the graveyard if my opponent gets over it. So there's always a way of getting this guy out, regardless if he's in a deck or in the graveyard. So now moving on to the one-ofs. So you're running one Hela. So she is essentially just a monster reborn. So all you have to do is just tribute her, herself, or one of your generator tokens in order to summon a monster from the graveyard. Yeah, they obviously have to be a generator monster. But she's just good for some of your main combos, which I get into later in deck profile. In addition to that, you're also running one Udgara. He's essentially just a targeted banish, so he's just really good removal whenever you need it. Again, you can also tribute generator tokens. In this case, there's going to be 2 of them in order to banish a card on board. And the last generator boss you're running is Mardell. So he's essentially just a Rhoda for the entire archetype. So typically what you're going to be doing is like using Lopter in order to special summon herself onto the board. And once you special summon, you can search out the boss stage because obviously it's a generator card. So that's typically what we're going to be using Mardell for, simply just to get into your field spell as soon as possible. So far I went over 8 level 9 monsters, but I wanted to round it up to 9, not just for aesthetics, but just for like the consistency of actually drawing multiple level 9 monsters in this deck to use in conjunction with Vala. I'll get into that in a bit, but the last one that I'm running is Trias Hierarchia. So she is absolutely insane in this deck. If you're not familiar with her effects, she can be activated as a quick effect in the hand or in the graveyard, so that's actually pretty important. Her effects basically states that you contribute up to 3 fairy monsters that you control to activate her effects, and her effects basically states that you can special summon her, then immediately afterwards blow up a card and draw 2 cards. So she's essentially just a guiding chimera for the archetype. And you may be wondering like which fairy monsters are you even referring to. So all your generator tokens are fairies, so you can just fill up your board every turn with boss stage with them, so you can have tiers online like literally like every single turn. In addition to that, Sleipnir, the monster that he summons or the token that he summons, whenever your opponent draws, is a fairy, so it's essentially just another generator token. So you can use the tokens that are generated off of this for tiers effect. And in addition to that, just note that cards like Vala and Lopter, they're also fairies. So you have a lot of different targets for tiers in this deck in order to get the effect off to blow up a card and draw 2 cards every single turn if you can. Just note that if she leaves the field, she will get banished. So just make sure, like similar to Vala, that you're going to be using her as exceeds material. So you just exceeds into her and you just attach her so that she goes into the graveyard instead of getting banished. So yeah, you're running 9 level 9 monsters. Again, you want that ratio because you want to draw multiple level 9s, and since you're running 3 Valas, you're likely of drawing this in another level 9 in order to actually go full combo. So that's kind of the justification for the ratios with that. So that actually wraps up the monster count, or like the main monster count. So I'll just get into the supporting cards now. So first off, you're running 2 Pot of Prosperities. So this is just for consistency. And I actually would run 3 copies of this, but I just don't have a 3rd copy. But yeah, if you have 3 copies, definitely run 3 copies of this because it's just such a powerful card. So yeah, and you definitely want to kind of prioritize getting into your boss stage, so it's definitely needed in this context. So I just run 2 copies of it currently. Once I get another one, I'll bump it up to 3. So a card that you absolutely must run at 3 is 3 World Legacy Monstrosities. So yeah, this card is definitely a monstrosity because this card is super broken. The only reason it's not banned is because it's level 9 support. But if it wasn't, if it was for any other level, it would have been completely broken. If you're not familiar with what this card does, it basically says that you can special summon 1 level 9 monster from your hand, so it just helps you on brick in that case. Especially if you don't have any other extension lines, you can just use this instead. But in addition to that, the other aspects of this card is what makes it completely broken. So its second effect states that you can target a level 9 monster that you have on board, and you can special summon 2 other level 9s from the deck for free They just have to have different types and attributes from whatever you targeting. So just going back to the runic engine for a second, just remember that like literally every single one of these cards is a free way of getting into Sleipnir, so which is a level 9. So if you have this in conjunction, or if you have any runic card in conjunction with World Legacy Monstrosity, then you have full combo. And like I mentioned before, since you're running 8 copies of these, or 8 runic spells, it's more than likely that you're going to have at least one of your initial mulligan, so you're typically always going to have full combo, especially if you have World Legacy in your hand as well. So the last supporting card that you're running is 2 Kuji-Kiri Curses. So if you're not familiar with what this card does, it just says that you contribute a level 9 monster from your hand or from the field to draw 2 cards. So it's just another draw card, another consistency card. And again, since you can use it with monsters in your hand, you're just almost always going to be live. And again, with the runic cards, like I mentioned before, you can always get into Sleipnir whenever you need it. So you can just go into this, use Kuji-Kiri Curse, tribute it, and then draw 2. So again, the runic engine just enables a lot of the level 9 toolbox in this deck. So moving on to hand traps. So you are playing 3 copies of Ash Blossom and 3 Droll and Lockbirds. So Ash Blossom has just been so much work this past weekend in on testing. And yeah, same thing with Droll and Lockbird. One thing on Droll and Lockbird that I will mention, it actually never came up once, but it's just something to know if you're going to be playing this deck, is that in conjunction with Har, typically you're going to be banished, or you're going to be tributing Generaider tokens in order to activate this effect, but this effect basically states that you can tribute Generaider monsters or spellcasters in order to get the Omni Negate effect. So let's say it's your turn and like all your tokens vanish at the end phase. You can just normal summon Droll and Lockbird because it's a spellcaster, and now you're pretty much set up for an Omni Negate so that you can go into your other plays. Obviously, it's very situational, and it never came up with me before, not even in testing, but in theory, it is something that could happen, so just keep that in mind while playing the deck. So moving on to the last couple cards in the deck, you're running 2 Lightning Strike Kaijus. So you're running this card because this is level 9, so it just has innate synergy with stuff like Kuji-Kiri Curse and Monstrosity. So I was also running stuff like Santa Claus for the draw power effect at the end phase, but these 2 cards just have additional synergy with these. And the reason why you're main decking Kaijus is because Kashtira is prevalent, at least in my locals, and people are playing purely as well. I can only see that deck becoming more popular over time in the format, so I think main decking Kaijus is kind of smart. And again, you're running the level 9 one because it just synergizes better with generators. And the last card that you're running in the main deck is just a Called by the Grave. You know, self-explanatory, just negates hand traps and any graveyard effects that might be triggering on your opponent's turn, so just a really good one-off. Okay, so I just get into the cards in the extra deck now. So I'll just start out with the Runic Fusions. So first off, you're playing 3 copies of Sleipnir and 1 copy of Freki. So again, pretty unorthodox, but I'll kind of explain it. The Sleipnirs, again, that kind of facilitates the whole reason why you're playing Runic in Generaider to begin with, so definitely want 2 copies of this. But in terms of the ratios, you definitely want more than 1, because there's certain instances where you're just going to be summoning this and using like a Kuji-Kiri Curse on it to just draw 2. So you definitely want another one just in case you need to extend further afterwards. But in terms of running 3, I just never went into 3, so it just kind of seemed unnecessary. Not even in testing, so I just keep it at 2 for now. So if these are only 2 cards that you may need, then you know you don't have to waste a lot of money on it on a new set. And you're also running 1 Freki, simply being because this is the only way that you can recur runic spells from your graveyard, and at least in this variant of the deck. And it also just helps you from like getting OTK'd, because any battle damage that you would take involving this card is 0, so you can just special summon it during your opponent's battle phase and then get this out. Also, when it's destroyed, you can just add a runic spell from your graveyard to your hand. So it's just really good overall, just to kind of help stall out the game so you can get more advantage off of Boss Stage. And the last fusion that you're running is Gura, because you're also running another Xseeds in your extra deck which is Meteorologic Aggregator. So the concept of this is that it's another generic level 9 monster, or rank 9 monster that you can use level 9s to get into. And once you exceeds into this, you can activate its effect to send a monster from your extra deck to the graveyard. So the main target is going to be Garura. And once this is sent to the graveyard, you draw a card, so it's just free draw power. However, it has another effect where you can basically swap out the materials for it with anything that's in your graveyard. So you can just attach and then reattach the Garura to it. So now, if this gets sent to the graveyard, its third effect will activate where you can just negate a monster effect out on board for until the end of the turn, and you'll also get an additional draw because this was sent to the graveyard again. However, if your opponent doesn't destroy it, then you can just constantly like use this effect to detach it and then reattach something else and get the free draw off of Garura like literally every turn. So yeah, that's the main reason why I'm running the Garura and the Meteorologic Aggregator, just for draw power. And on that note, you're also running the 1 Zeus. So you're running him because most of the cards in your extra deck are Exceeds. So you just simply have to attack with one of them, and during your main phase 2, you just overlay into the Zeus. That works especially well with the Meteorologic Aggregator, especially if you kind of utilize this effect multiple times already. And especially if you already have the Garura as an attachment. So you can just attack with this and then main phase 2 overlay into the Zeus. And now you have essentially 2 interruptions. You have the interruption of the Zeus obviously, and then you have monster negation when you send this to the graveyard. And obviously to draw one with Garura once it gets sent to the graveyard again. So it's just a really good board wipe that you can kind of utilize with any of the other Xyzs as well, not just Meteorologic Aggregator. So moving on to the Generaider Xyzs that you're playing, you're running 2 Leviathans and 2 Jormungandrs. So for Leviathan, I can honestly say that this is probably like one of the best removal cards in the entire game, if not one of them. This card's just insane. If you're not familiar with what this card does, it basically makes it so that you can tribute it in order to special summon a non-fairy Generaider boss monster from your extra deck. So your only target is going to be Jormungandr. And depending on how many materials this card had when you tributed it, you can attach that many cards from your opponent's field and graveyard to it. So like for instance, if your opponent like sets 2 and tries to pass, you can just tribute this at the end phase, summon this in defense, and then just attach those 2 set cards that your opponent had to it. And usually your opponent would scoop after that because that's pretty brutal. You can also just attach stuff from your opponent's graveyard as well. So if they're going to try to activate some crap in order to interrupt your board, you can just attach that instead. So this card is just insane removal. It's like it's almost broken. And Jormungandr, again, you're mainly using it for the Leviathan's effect, but he's also good individually as well, because he's a quick effect where you can force both players to draw. So it kind of facilitates the whole negative aspects of drawing for your opponent, that whole small aspect of the deck. And for every player that drew a card, so that includes you, you can attach another card to it. And for every card that this card has attached, it gains 1000 attack and defense. So this card can easily get up to like 5000, 6000 attack very easily after like 2 turns. So it's just like a persistent threat that your opponent is going to have to deal with, because they're just going to continue like ripping resources from your opponent's hand and field unless they deal with it. So yeah, you definitely want to run 2 copies of this, again for prosperity and just for going into it with Leviathan. So you're also running 1 copy of Sacred Tree Beast. So you're running this card because it's just another negation that you can put on board, because it's a generic level 9 or rank 9 monster. So you can just go into it with Sleipnir or any of your Generaider bosses. The effect of this one is really good because you can detach the type of card that your opponent is activating. So if you want to negate a monster effect, you can just attach a monster card from it and negate that effect. However, you typically only go into this if you already activated a runic spell, because it also has another effect where when you activate a card, you can attach another card from your graveyard to it. So in this case, you would attach the runic tip to it, and now you have a spell negation as well. So whenever your opponent activates a spell, you can just attach the Runick quick play spell, and now you have a negation for that. So typically I only go into this if I already activated a Runick quick play spell previously that turn, or Monstrosity or anything. So yeah, it's just good to have that additional negation whenever you need it for certain matchups. So going over the last couple of extra deck monsters that you have, you're running 2 Enter Fafnirs. So this card is pretty degenerate, but it works really well in this deck, so I think it's actually required. This card is just kind of stupid. It basically says that you can detach a card and then banish a card basically wherever you want. You can banish it from the top of your opponent's deck or in the graveyard or on their field. But the more powerful effect is banishing a random card from your opponent's hand. So it's a hand rip. So typically you're always going to be using that unless you just need to get rid of a problematic card on your opponent's board. And typically I'll only go into this if my opponent hand trapped me, so I can just punish them. So if my opponent like used Ash or Droll and Lockbird, then I'll go into this combo here. And if you're not familiar with the combo, it's basically the same thing that I mentioned before with Monstrosity. Basically getting both of them out and then overlaying them into the F-Zero package. So just to kind of go over that one more time, let's say that you activate like a Runick quick play spell in order to summon out Sleipnir. So now you have like a level 9 on board. What you'll do is that you just target Monstrosity in order to special summon out the Vala and then the Hela. And then you overlay both of these for one of the Enter Fafnirs. So what you'll do here is that you would just detach the Vala in order to hand rip your opponent for 1. So if your opponent hand trapped you at this point, now they only have 3 cards in hand. What you'll do at this point is that you'll activate Hela's effect to tribute her to bring back the Vala, and now that she's summoned, you can special summon back the Hela from the graveyard. And at this point you just overlay both of them and to go into the Enter Fafnir. And obviously you detach in order to hand rip your opponent again. So you just hand rip your opponent for 2 and they use hand traps on you, probably 1 to 2 of them. So now your opponent is running out with either 2 or 1 cards in their hand. So I would just do that to just punish my opponent. And usually this is the more optimal play to go down, because just having your opponent started with less resources is always good. But it doesn't stop here. Afterwards you can just overlay both of them to play the other cards that you're running in the extra deck, which is the F-Zero package. So you're running Utopic Future, and then you overlay for Utopic Draco Future. And if you're not familiar with what this card does, it's essentially just a monster negation / change of heart. So you just negate a monster effect and then take control of it. And just note that if your board is filled like with generator tokens, then it just gets destroyed. Just know that about that ruling. If you try to take a monster when your board is filled, then it just gets blown up. And yeah, it can't be destroyed by battle or by card effects, and it's 3000, so your opponent's going to have a lot of fun getting over this, on top of just like having 3 to 1 cards in their hand when they start. So it's pretty brutal combo, and it's very consistent getting into it. Again, you don't need Monstrosity in order to get into this combo. That's just like the easiest way of doing it in this deck. But yeah, that kind of wraps up all the cards in the extra deck. Okay, so I'll just quickly go over the side deck. Again, it's not going to be the same for you, whoever's watching, because it's going to be different depending on what metagame that you're playing in. And even this is going to change over time because technically the format hasn't even started yet. So, you can just take this with a grain of salt. But I just give you some insights on like what I'm playing, just so you can get an idea. First off, I guess I'll just go over these. So you're running 4 of the generator tokens. Especially if you want to pick these up, I would just recommend getting 4 because they're pretty pricey considering they're just tokens. You only need 4 because in order to actually summon them, you need to summon a monster during your opponent's turn off of boss stage. So when you summon like any generator monster, then they're using one of your monster zone slots. So you only have 4 other ones in order to special summon onto the field. So at any given time, you're only going to be able to summon that max 4 of them. So yeah, if you want to pick them up, just pick up 4. You don't really need 5 of them. And actually getting into the extra deck monsters, you're running 1 Hard Earth Dragon. So this card is pretty good against any trap-based decks, especially if you're going first, because it has an effect where during your opponent's end phase, you can just banish all cards that they normal summon, special summon, or set. And the big thing about that is banishing set cards. So if you're playing against Labyrinth or Trap Tricks or whatever, you can just banish your entire board, and they can't really respond to any of it because you know, they're all traps. So you're gonna have to wait until my turn. But since you're doing this at the end of your opponent's turn, then essentially their entire board gets banished. So I would typically always side this in if I'm playing as a trap-based deck and like turbo this out instead of Leviathan or enter Fafnir. So I just keep this in a side deck for those specific matchups. You're also playing one Moonin, so I do this for time. I already mentioned the story with this one. You don't need to main deck it because there's really no reason to it. You only do it for a time. In addition to that, you're running 2 Kurikaras and 2 Lava Golems. So I'm running these cards, specifically Kurikaras for the Kashtira and Purely matchups. I think they're going to be a little bit more prevalent in the meta moving forward. I kind of dismissed Kashtira as like being dead initially, but I can see that it's kind of here to stay until another ban list. So just running 2 copies of this, and Purely is going to be more popular because you're also getting new support in Duelist Nexus. And the Lava Golems, again, you don't really need to normal summon in this deck. Lopter obviously is a good normal summon, but you can easily be special summon with a Vala's effect. So yeah, I just have the Lava Golems in case I just need it for certain matchups, especially the ones that just build wide boards like Infernal Knight or any synchro spam decks out there. In addition to that, you're running 2 Runick Destructions and 2 Freezing Curses. So these are just additional Runick cards that I put in my deck if I need them. And these are like the more impactful ones, or the more specific ones that have the most impact on the game in specific matchups. So I obviously put this in against back row decks, or ones I use a lot of continuous spells and traps. And I use the Freezing Curses if I just need like additional effect negation, because effect negation just in general this format is really good. So I just have 2 extra copies of those when I need them. In addition to that, you're also running 3 Dark Ruler No More. Again, really good against all the Sprite variants, at least in my locals. It seems like half of the people are playing Sprite. So I think this is actually like required, at least in my case. So I'm just running 3 copies of it. And yeah, against any synchro spam deck is also really good if you're going second. And the last card you're running is 2 Lightning Storm. You know, pretty self-explanatory. You know, you're just running this for, you know, broad-based removal from the back row usually, but you can also do it in the monster zone as well if your opponent was careless and put everything in attack. So you put those in, going second as well. So before wrapping up, I just wanted to go over some cards that I did drop over this past weekend. I initially had them in the list while testing and stuff, but after like fuller analysis, I decided to cut them because they're either too bricky or it just didn't make any sense. So I was playing Santa Claus as opposed to playing the Kaijus, because at the end phase you can draw a card, or you can force your opponent to draw a card, and that has like a bunch of synergy with Har and Boss Stage, but it doesn't really make much sense, especially if you don't have Har on board, because usually you'll bring out Har during your opponent's draw phase, not during your end phase, if that makes sense. So it just made sense to run the Lightning Strike Kaijus because it just works with Kuji-Kiri Curse and Monstrosity better. Another one I was running was Donner. I decided to cut her because there wasn't really a need to run her anymore since I wasn't running Hugin. So Sleipnir can basically remove himself from the extra monster zone by banishing a card in itself during your main phase or your opponent's battle phase. So you don't really need a card like this in order to clear out the extra monster zone anymore. So I decided to remove that. I was also running Nidhogg. It was another Generator Boss monster, but it only works with inherent summons, which is a little bit too specific, so I decided to cut that and replace it with Tears instead. I was running the Boss Quest engine, so I was running Boss Quest and Generator Boss Room. These 2 cards were good because you can just activate Boss Quest and search this in the field spell. So it was just really good getting a bunch of resources in your hand and getting a continuous spell or continuous trap, which is essentially just like an effect negation. But these two are a little bit too situational. It can be bricky because you need a level, or you need a generator monster in order to even activate this effect. So you put on the bottom of the deck to search. And this one, it can just be a brick on itself because it doesn't really do much unless you have a full board or setup. So decided to cut those. I decided to cut Entis because you can use it with Mirrologic Aggregator, but again, Leviathan is just the better removal because you can just suck up whatever your opponent is about to use, and they can't access it at all unless they get rid of the Jormungandr. So I decided to cut it because it's a little bit too redundant. I just stick with Guru instead. And the last card that I was running is the Hugin. So you may think that this card protects you against like stuff like Dark Hole and Raigeki. You can just use any Runick's quick play spell to summon it out. However, that doesn't actually work. If this card is also going to get destroyed, along with your other monsters that you're trying to protect, then you can actually substitute it. It will only work in a case where your opponent's about to destroy something, and Hugin's still going to be on the field afterwards. So you're just essentially just swapping out this destruction of the other card that you have. But if your opponent's going to just like wipe your entire board, then Hugin actually doesn't do anything. So it doesn't work against Dark Hole or Raigeki. It could work against Lightning Storm if you put it in defense, but that's about it. So since it's a little bit too limited and you're also not running the field spell, it just didn't really seem worth it. I never went into it. So yeah, that's pretty much all that I have for this deck profile. I know it's a little bit longer than normal, but you know, this is a new deck, so I just kind of wanted to explain it a little bit more in depth, just so you kind of understand like the core concepts of it and like how I built the deck. Because it's a little bit unconventional. It's definitely different from other Runick variants that you may have seen. So yeah, thank you again for watching, and I'll see you later.